From Beethoven to Bon Jovi to Beyoncé, music has driven society for millennia. It has served many purposes across times and cultures, communicating plans among the Underground Railroads, expressing worship across religions, uniting people in celebration, and so much more. As humanity progressed from ancient times to the modern day, music has become more widespread and more advanced than ever. As our material world digitized, music itself has changed and become one with contemporary influences. The invention of the musical instrument digital interface, or MIDI, acted as a turning point in the early 1980s, taking music production from having a limited selection of sounds and a necessity for extensive resources to becoming an accessible and empowering art form driven by a broad variety of unique sounds. The 70s were a time of protest after the civil rights movement and Stonewall riots of 1969. Controversy shook the country with the ongoing war in Vietnam and the Watergate scandal. The transition into the 80s brought materialism, the rise of blockbuster movies and popular television networks, and the AIDS crisis. As far as technology goes, computers during these 2 decades went from the hands of rich corporations to households, with the release of Microsoft Word and the first Apple computer. Digital entertainment also rapidly grew with the release of the Japanese video game Pac-Man. Rising out of the ashes of post-World War poverty, Japan had entered a new industrial period marked by consumerism. By the 1970s, Japan's economy was soaring as the second largest in the world and had incentivized the production of digital systems. Businesses like Sony and Roland began to manufacture everything from TVs to audio systems. This technological renaissance opened many doors for the digitalization of the corporate world as well as entertainment in the forms of video games, films, arts, and evidently music. In the American 70s, brands like ARP and Moog released sequencers, devices which store notes and rhythm messages that have the ability to communicate with some synthesizers, which turn those messages into the unique sound that hit your ear. However, only deep-pocketed specialists had access to this equipment and the knowledge to operate it. And a lot of the equipment couldn't connect between manufacturers, creating a large obstacle for music producing. This meant that very few people had access to the opportunity and/or resources to create recorded music. In terms of the music itself, only one note could be played at a time, and the system was unreliable and difficult to fix. As the sound of polyphony or multiple simultaneous notes rose in popularity, there was increasing demand for easier production, ultimately launching a revolution to solve these issues and satisfy the needs of musicians across the globe. Ikutaro Kakehashi of Roland Corporation in Osaka, Japan, and Dave Smith of Sequential Circuits in San Francisco, California, started their journey to create a standard of technological communication across multiple music devices.
Dave Smith, with the close help of sound designer John Bowen, set out to create the world's first programmable polyphonic synthesizer, which would be called Sequential Circuits Prophet 5. The Prophet 5 was able to produce multiple sounds at once as demanded by artists everywhere and is responsible for the classic sound of 80s pop music. Smith first showed the Prophet 5 to the National Association of Musical Merchants' 1978 Winter Convention. It gained shocking but deserved recognition from artists and became a blueprint of modern music. Almost every major artist used the Prophet 5 for both live and recorded music. Its distinct sound became a staple of songs both then and now. Demand grew so great that Dave Smith reported that artists would beg their offices for whatever products they had left. While the Prophet 5 was gaining rapid attention, David Smith was still looking for a way to standardize the communication between devices of different manufacturers. So, in 1981, he and engineer Chet Wood presented a proposal for a universal synthesizer interface at the Audio Engineer Society's National Convention. Since Kakehashi was thinking of similar concepts across the Pacific, he and Dave Smith came together to convince music makers of the world to join their side of the musical revolution.
And we sat there and talked for a few hours, and it became clear that a lot of people had no interest in the compromise aspect of this.
Manufacturers were hesitant to give up their isolated ecosystems and favored their business models of selling products with proprietary components that required other products from the same family. This was standard among big companies such as Moog and Oasis. However, once manufacturers realized that it was in their best interest to make their devices more accessible to customers of varying skill and wealth, they ultimately decided to buy into the new standard Smith was cooking up.
And we sat down, just a small group of us, and we just said, let's do it. Forget everybody else. Nobody else is interested in it. Let's just do it.
Music merchants and designers were won over at the National Association of Music Merchants Convention of 1982, where Smith and Kakahashi, with the vocal support of the major instrument manufacturers, showed the world how their new language could communicate between two separately manufactured instruments, using the Sequential Circuits Prophet 600 and the Roland's Jupiter 6. This incited a pivot within the entire industry, and they called this new language Musical Instrument Digital Interface, or MIDI.
It really exploded because it's cheaper than, and it's not a proprietary system, so you could have any number of companies' products in your arsenal.
You could hear loops and stuff, and drum machines and all that kind of thing was all the rage, I guess. So that, to me, yeah, I guess you could say it was a MIDI revolution of some kind in the music business, and you can definitely hear it.
MIDI was quickly accepted among many artists. The band Rush debuted in the mid-70s but really took off in the 80s with the rise of MIDI. Since they were a three-person band, this breakthrough in technology allowed them to play multiple instruments at a time, sounding more like the record and providing a fuller instrument that three people wouldn't have otherwise been capable of live. You can even hear the difference in their production before MIDI and with MIDI. Nowadays, artists like Charlie Puth are using MIDI in both similar and newer ways.
Let's go to the studio. First step, turn on the MIDI keyboard, cool lamp.
Since MIDI offered a way to connect equipment easily and affordably, musicians who are just starting out have been able to create more than ever. Even beginner musicians are now able to build their own home studios, allowing for writing, recording, and releasing of music. This spun off a whole new era of independent artists, turning the word indie from a status of funding to a whole new genre.
The day of getting found on a label is like really kind of in the past, right? Like you usually make your career and then a label discovers you and then you get taken off. And I think that comes from being able to do everything on the computer using MIDI.
For example, Phineas O'Connell sprouted from the music he made when he was young, independent, and recording music with MIDI. Phineas started as a bedroom producer and went on to win 10 Grammys.
The way I want any home studio to function is like I want it all to be like as fast as I can think of an idea. I want to be able to articulate it because we're not at a recording studio where different people are there every day and people are down the hall. Like it's our house and it's where we live and it's where we have experienced everything.
Some argue that modern music has taken a turn for the worse since the 80s by offering inexperienced artists a platform and devaluing live recordings. Many view artists' new ability to access digital instruments as a decline in talent and knowledge, as opposed to an opportunity for new sounds and explorations.
Actual musicians are getting kind of snubbed for these $1,000 plugins that make it sound real, and that's all has to do with MIDI.
However, many others believe that live recordings we hear today were actually improved by MIDI as well. Due to sampling and accessibility of equipment, artists can write music for instruments without the presence of a live musician.
And if a person is capable of writing all the parts, there's a complete circle that's made, and the feeling and the emotion that comes out is quite magical. It's something that's been missing in many of the projects that I have done in the past.
This allows artists to have more control and ability to foster their own sound.
It's like it just feels like I'm playing with a band, and I'm the band, so I can control everything.
MIDI has given artists many capabilities, such as creating music outside of a studio, accessing innumerable digital instruments, layering sounds live, and easily editing existing tracks to fit a song's needs. As perspectives outside of the industry, many concertgoers are inspired to appreciate live music more, as musicians now have the ability to match the sounds on the records. Today, the invention of MIDI is recognized in the Museum of Making Music in Carlsbad, California, and it is rare to find an artist or genre that has not been impacted by it technologically, societally, or economically. MIDI has made it possible for sequencers and synthesizers to connect and communicate with a new standardized language, thus turning music production from an art of the rich and powerful to one for all people, opening music up to new sounds and new people, which revolutionized the art form from the 80s up till now.
MIDI has really helped just about anybody.
Down the road, we're going to find that these new technologies are making all sorts of new possibilities for musicians to creatively express themselves.